My name is Claire Hudson, and my brother punched me in the face at my own wedding. It was not an accident. It was not the clumsy move of a man who had one too many drinks. It was a fist, fast and deliberate, that crashed against my cheek with a sound I will never forget. 1 second I was holding my vows, the next I was stumbling backward, my head ringing while my veil slipped off my shoulder. The entire garden froze. A champagne glass dropped somewhere behind me, shattering against the stone walkway, and the sharp sound echoed in the silence that followed. Guests stood with their mouths open, their eyes darting between me and Ryan, like they needed permission to believe what had just happened. The music kept playing for half a beat, then died out too late, as if refusing to match the horror it had just soundtracked. I remember the sting spreading across my face, the heat rising under my skin, and the taste of blood pooling inside my mouth. My veil caught on the heel of my shoe as I fought to steady myself, and I almost tripped over the dress my mother had chosen before she passed away. My grandmother gasped so loudly I heard it above everything else, and I thought, in the most absurd way, that my lipstick must have smudged. Ryan's eyes were locked on me, cold and blazing all at once. He did not stumble. He did not slur. He looked satisfied, like he had just proved something to everyone standing there. My husband, Jack Monroe, moved toward me in a flash. But for a moment, all I could process was the silence pressing in, heavy and unbroken. That is the thing about violence. The noise is sudden, but it is the silence that swallows you whole afterward. 70 people stood rooted to the ground, some staring, others looking away, but no one moving. I was the bride, in white silk and lace, with a swollen cheek and blood in my mouth, and not one person knew what to do. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just stood there, dazed and humiliated, with my heart pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. I searched the crowd, hoping for someone to intervene, but all I saw were frozen faces and whispered questions that never left their lips. The shame was sharper than the pain. And then the realization hit me. My brother had not only shattered the day meant to celebrate love and unity, he had done it in front of everyone we knew. The guests were not only witnesses to a wedding anymore, they were witnesses to betrayal. Why? Why would Ryan, my own brother, raise his hand against me on the one day I was supposed to feel most safe? That question lingered in the silence, louder than the punch itself, demanding an answer I was not ready to give. Growing up in a military family meant everything was about discipline and appearances. My father wore his uniform like a second skin, and my mother kept the house spotless, as if order could erase the exhaustion etched into her face. Ryan thrived in that world. He was loud, confident, and exactly what they wanted a son to be. I was quieter, always watching from the sidelines, the daughter who blended into the background. When Ryan scored a goal in soccer or earned praise from teachers, my parents clapped loudly and told him he was destined for greatness. When I brought home good grades, they nodded politely and told me to keep working hard. The difference was subtle at first, but it grew heavier each year until I learned to expect less. Ryan basked in the spotlight while I learned how to stay small so the imbalance hurt less. At home, the shine he wore outside turned sharp. He would take my things without asking, tear the covers off my bed in the middle of the night, or shove me just enough to remind me who set the rules. If I cried, he laughed. If I stayed silent, he sneered and called me weak. My parents never stepped in. They called it sibling rivalry and told me to toughen up, as if silence could build armor. So I adapted. I learned not to complain, not to ask for help, not to expect fairness. I kept my head down and my voice soft, hoping it would keep the peace, even when it didn't. I told myself that surviving in silence was safer than fighting battles no one would acknowledge. And that pattern followed me far longer than I wanted to admit. As we grew older, the distance between Ryan and me widened into something sharp. I built my life through education and hard work, carving out success in ways that never needed applause. Ryan clung to his stories of combat, medals, and the kind of authority that demanded recognition. In family gatherings, he would talk loudly about missions and danger, and everyone leaned in as if he were the only one worth hearing. When people asked about my career, he often cut in with jokes that made me seem small. He called my achievements technical or boring, as if intelligence was less valuable than brute strength. Once, after I gave a presentation at a fundraiser, he laughed in front of a group and said, "Didn't know PowerPoint counted as service." They laughed with him. I smiled too, but inside I felt the old weight of being dismissed. The truth was, I never wanted to compete with him. I just wanted space to exist without being compared, but he could not stand it. Each time I spoke with confidence, I saw his jaw tighten, like my voice was stealing something from him. He kept a ledger of my mistakes and retold them whenever he could, reshaping them into cautionary tales to remind me where I belonged. By then, I understood it was not about me failing him. It was about him refusing to see me as anything but competition. I stopped expecting closeness, but the resentment only deepened. What began as sibling rivalry had turned into something toxic, a constant reminder that my existence and strength made him feel weaker, and that was a burden he never forgave me for carrying. I met Jack Monroe during a joint training assignment, in a place that felt more like punishment than preparation. The air was dry, the ground cracked, and tempers wore thin in the heat. Most people filled the space with noise, trying to prove their strength through volume. Jack was different. He moved quietly, steady, in a way that made others notice, without him demanding attention. The first time I really saw him, I was bent over a map spread across a dusty table, brushing sand off the lines while a group argued around me. Their voices clashed, each man trying to dominate the conversation with big words and bigger egos. Jack stood at the edge, silent, watching. Then he stepped closer and said softly, "You're the only one actually looking at the map." He didn't smile. He didn't explain. He just waited until I looked up. And in that moment, I felt seen. That was his way. He never competed for space, but somehow space bent around him. When others pushed and bragged, he stayed calm, and it unsettled people who relied on intimidation. He never barked orders, but when he finally spoke, everyone listened. It was not about power. It was about presence. That stillness carried more weight than any outburst could. One evening, after hours in the field, a group gathered around a fire with rationed coffee and empty stories. Jack sat apart, quiet, sipping from a dented metal cup. I walked over, offering him half of a protein bar I had forgotten in my pocket. He accepted it without ceremony, as if I had handed him something important. After a long pause, he asked, "What do you miss most about peace?" It startled me. Not what I missed about home, or what I wanted to do when I left, but peace. I thought about it and finally said, "Not having to look over my shoulder." He nodded once. "That's a good one." He didn't elaborate. He didn't fill the silence with small talk. The moment lingered because it was enough. From then on, I noticed him more. The way he studied a room before speaking. The way he never mocked or interrupted. The way his restraint was not weakness but control. Around him, I felt like I didn't have to defend every word I said. I could just be. That feeling of safety, quiet but undeniable, was something I had never known before. Jack was everything Ryan was not. Where Ryan sought dominance, Jack offered steadiness. Where Ryan thrived on making others smaller, Jack allowed people to breathe. It was not a performance. It was who he was. And in his stillness, I found a place where my voice mattered, not because it was loud, but because it was mine. That was the moment I began to realize what it meant to feel protected without condition. The garden had been transformed into something out of a dream. White lanterns hung from the trees, swaying gently in the breeze, and rows of chairs curved toward an arch, wrapped in magnolia blossoms. The stone path had been cleaned until it gleamed, and the late afternoon light cast a soft glow across the scene. My dress trailed behind me as I walked, and for a moment, it felt like every step carried me closer to a promise I had waited my whole life to find. Guests shifted in their seats, smiling, whispering, and snapping photos while the music played low in the background. My heart raced, but it was the kind of nervous joy that felt electric, the kind that comes when you realize you are standing in the middle of your own beginning. Jack stood at the altar, steady and calm. his presence grounding me as I took in the faces of people who had come to witness us. For a few minutes, the world felt whole. Then Ryan arrived. 15 minutes late, his uniform pressed perfectly. Why, but his face flushed. The smell of alcohol drifted with him, sharp and sour, and the energy in the garden shifted in an instant. He walked down the aisle as if it belonged to him, drawing eyes away from me, away from the vows about to be spoken. The unease rippled through the crowd, but no one said a word. And in that silence, a knot formed in my chest, warning me that the peace of the moment was already slipping away. I had just opened my mouth to speak my vows when Ryan stepped out from the second row. His stride was sharp, deliberate, his jaw tight as if he were marching into battle. Before I could react, his fist connected with my cheek, a blunt strike that sent pain radiating through my face and forced me back 2 steps, nearly tangling me in my dress. The sound of flesh meeting bone echoed louder than the music, louder than the gasps, louder than the glass that shattered in someone's hand. The garden froze. 70 people stood silent, eyes wide, breaths caught in their throats. I tasted blood and felt heat swell under my skin, but the greater weight was the shame of standing there. The bride struck down in front of everyone who had come for love. Jack moved before I could even steady myself. He stepped between us with a stillness that carried more threat than any raised voice could. His gaze cut into Ryan, cold and precise, and when he spoke, his words dropped like steel. "Face the wall. You assaulted an officer." No one moved, not even Ryan. His face flickered with disbelief, then panic, as the weight of those words settled on him. The crowd stayed silent, watching as his authority collapsed in an instant. Jack's calm command had stripped him of power more completely than any blow could have. Ryan stood there, humiliated, exposed in front of every guest, and for the first time in my life, I saw my brother without the shield of respect he had always demanded. The ceremony did not end when Ryan was led away. It ended in a silence, so heavy it seemed to press against my chest. I stood at the front, with my cheek throbbing, my dress torn at the hem, and 70 pairs of eyes locked on me. Some people stared openly, others turned their faces down, and a few whispered like they were trying to explain it to themselves. I thought anger would come first, but it didn't. What I felt was clarity, the sharp kind that follows when an illusion breaks too loudly to ignore. My brother had shown everyone what I had known in smaller ways for years, and now no one could pretend anymore. The shame was there, yes, but so was a strange relief that the truth had stepped out of hiding. Jack never left my side. He didn't rush me with questions or wrap me in speeches about being strong. He simply stood close enough for me to feel the steadiness of his presence, his hand brushing against mine until I finally took it. That touch anchored me more than any words could. Around us, guests fumbled. My aunt pressed her hands over her mouth. A toddler cried in the back. A man from my father's unit coughed and looked away, as if pretending not to see would make it less real. A few people stepped forward, then retreated when they realized no one else was moving. Unity had vanished, and what remained was fear of choosing sides. I could have walked away. I could have demanded the ceremony stop, but instead I turned to Jack. My voice shook as I whispered, "Do you still want to?" He nodded without hesitation, and we stood together under the crooked arch and spoke our vows. They were not smooth. They were not polished, but they were true. Later, at the reception, people hovered around the edges. Some offered apologies they didn't owe. Others left early, unable to stay in a room that now carried the weight of violence. The food sat untouched. The music felt hollow, but Jack stayed close. He didn't explain or try to make the day normal. He just stayed. That night, in the quiet after everyone had gone, I sat with a cold compress pressed to my cheek. Jack poured 2 glasses of water and handed me one without a word. We sat side by side, shoulders touching, breathing in sync. My body ached, but in that stillness I understood something I had never felt before. For the first time in my life, I was not alone in the aftermath. The healing had already begun. In the year that followed the wedding, I learned that silence does not stay still. It grows, it spreads, and it protects the wrong people. For months, I lived in the shadow of that day, carrying the bruise that faded on my skin but never in memory. Then, one by one, women began to come forward. They were colleagues, subordinates, women who had worked under Ryan's command. Their stories were different from mine, but the pattern was the same. He used charm in public and control in private. He undermined them, threatened their careers, and chipped away at their confidence until they questioned their own worth. None of them had spoken before because they thought no one would believe them. When I sat across from one of them, I listened to her tremble through her story, and I saw my younger self reflected in her. I opened a drawer and slid across copies of the incident report from my wedding. "You're not alone," I said. Her shoulders dropped in relief, and I knew in that moment the silence had finally cracked. Word spread quickly, others added their voices, and soon the weight of testimony was too heavy to ignore. The military postponed his promotion, then placed him under review. The man who had once commanded rooms with his presence now faced the collapse of everything he had built. His power had lived in silence, but silence was gone. For the first time in years, I felt justice breathe through the cracks of what he had broken. Not revenge, not triumph, but truth. I understood then that silence is how men like him survive, and breaking silence is how they fall. The cost was heavy, but the story was no longer his to control. When Jack and I left the military, it did not feel like defeat. It felt like stepping out of the armor we had worn for too long. We moved to a quiet town where the mornings were slow, the air smelled of pine, and the only sounds at night were crickets and our own breathing. For the first time in years, I could hear my own thoughts without the weight of orders or rank pressing on me. Our house was simple, with a wide porch that caught the sun in the evenings. Jack built a small shed out back where he worked with his hands, while I found my place at a local center helping veterans and their families. I was not a therapist, but I knew how to listen. I understood the silence of people who had carried too much, and I could sit with them without rushing their pain away. Each story reminded me that healing was not about erasing the past. It was about learning how to live with it without fear. 2 years later, I returned to the garden where my wedding had been shattered. The magnolia tree still stood, its branches heavy with blossoms, and the stone path curved the same way it had before. But the chairs were gone, the crowd was gone, and this time it was just Jack and me. I wore a simple dress and no makeup. We spoke quiet vows to each other, not for an audience, not for approval, but for ourselves. As we walked along the fence at the back of the property, I placed my hand on the rough wood and felt no fear. The ghosts of that day no longer held me. I looked at Jack, steady as always, and felt the stillness of peace settle inside me. I smiled, breathed deep, and whispered the words I had waited years to say. This time, I am free.